This photo of a wrecked boat with democracy spray painted on the side reminded me of a couple of abandoned boats that I saw washed up on the Red Sea back when I sailed through there, God, about 2 decades ago, off the coast of what is now Eritrea. The Red Sea and the history that the Red Sea has included both on it as well as the countries around it are absolutely unparalleled. A lot of people pay more attention to Israel and Egypt or to Saudi Arabia or Yemen, but I think Ethiopia and Eritrea kind of typifies the trends of democracy and conflict in which we're going to be talking about today, as well as in other weeks of this course. Eritrea fought a long battle with the central Ethiopian government for independence. That escalated after the end of the Cold War, finally became independent, and kind of celebrated that foundation myth. I don't have any of the money here with me, but female freedom fighters are on the backside of one of the bills of the country, and you can see wrecks in the Red Sea, both between the Ethiopian forces trying to fight off the Italian forces in World War II, and when Italy tried to establish a colony in Ethiopia, as well as this freedom fight in the battle between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And both countries have really been overlooked now in recent months. Ethiopia has received more attention in recent years because after the new president came into power, there was a lot of hope that he would open up the system. He ended up winning a Nobel Peace Prize for the efforts to end the border dispute and tensions with Eritrea a couple of years ago. But then since the Tigray region became more restive, the amount of governmental repression seen in that region caused the Ethiopian government to be sidelined and criticized by a number of international actors. Eritrea, since independence, has been one of the most repressive governments according to the measures that I talked about in the previous video. No free and fair election has occurred since independence, and the leadership there has been quite ruthless in being able to maintain control. And you can see this using the varieties of democracy data. Here you see in Eritrea a bit of opening around the end of World War II, and then a little bit of opening for the civil liberties in the 1990s, but that quickly was quashed after independence. And the last couple of decades have seen quite low levels of overall levels of democracy, civil liberties, as well as electoral democracy. Compare that with Ethiopia, which was seen as having its own, of course, dictatorship period, the end of the Cold War. The electoral democracies section index became a bit better, and civil liberties noticeably so. You see that huge spike after the new president came into power, and the quick backsliding in the last couple of years due to the activities in trying to crack down on the Tigrayan region. And so you can see this as an instance of an autocratic state trying to maintain control, an autocratic state becoming autocratic after becoming independent. These are often not as mentioned as much as democratic states, and autocratic states attacking democratic states, like with Russia and with Ukraine just in the last year. And in talking about democracy and conflict, it is impossible to not, I guess it's not impossible, everything is possible if you have the interest in doing so, but when trying to talk about the role of democracy and in preventing conflict, most international relations scholars would start with the democratic peace. The Håvard Hegre piece for this week that students will have read, the link is in the description below, talked about how in the international conflict literature, and Jack Levy famously put it in this quote: "The democratic peace is the closest thing we have to empirical law in the study of international relations," and this is based off the fact that no two democracies have ever fought an interstate war against each other. Some people have talked about how Russia and Georgia's conflict a little over a decade ago might violate that. There's other kind of marginal cases, as well as how you define a democracy. If they were able to target another state, can you kind of, after the fact, say they weren't really a democracy? But basically, the empirical observation is that no two consolidated democratic countries have ever kind of gone to war. And the literature has spent a lot of time, effort, and ink in trying to explain why that would be the case, right? And in the article that we read for this week, the literature review by Håvard Hegre, he groups the literature's explanations usefully into five main areas. One is just a normative explanation for why democracies don't fight each other. They both see the other states' democratic institutions as being legitimate, and that it is not how countries self-identify as democracies that they would invade or go to war with another democracy. So there's a normative element that places restrictions on how they interact and deal with their differences. Another explanation would be legislative constraints, that democracies have rules about declaring war. There could be temporary emergency powers given to particular countries, but by and large there is some accountability for the ability for an executive to declare war or to use war without the legislature having to acquiesce to that. A third reason would be signaling resolve. Democracies, because they are beholden to their citizens, when they do signal they really care about a particular issue, that signal is credible. It's the resolve is credible because the leader would show some kind of cost if they don't follow through on that action. And so democracies' ability to signal resolve about an issue should make the other side more likely to try to reach a diplomatic solution. Fourth would be mobilization argument for why democracies don't go to war with each other, is that democracies are better able to mobilize their citizens, both because of normative behavior, like we saw in World War II, in which there was a push towards recruitment to fight a war, and because of the normative standing of the institutions of the government, people are more likely to join a conflict as well as to fight and use initiative in their fighting behavior, which makes them more likely to win a war. And so through mobilization in starting a war and being able to fight it, to make the other side realize that they're less likely to win, because the democratic state is more likely to be able to have the human resources and be able to deploy them in effective ways to make them more likely to win. The last one is a joint interest argument, and that is similar to the normative argument in the beginning, that kind of sees democracy as how the state's signaling to each other, and that some people say historically the reasons why democracies are clustered in Europe, and during the Cold War there was a convergence of interests of the democracies to combat against the USSR and their allies, that democracies had a history and a joint interest in working together for a long period of time, and that gives them joint interests after the end of the Cold War to deal with their differences in ways that are nonviolent. So these are 5 ways that Håvard Hegre summarizes the literature. I think it's a good way to summarize the different explanations for democracy, and what we're going to see in a second is how this could also apply to our understanding of the causes of civil war. And this plays into the Kantian triangle. People have been talking about the democratic peace and the effect of political institutions on warfighting capability, going back beyond Immanuel Kant to Thucydides. Everyone has to read Thucydides, right, in the first semester of most IR classes, because of the effect of understanding how political institutions affect how states fight wars. And Kant, Waltz, Fearon, others have looked at how these different factors of democratic political institutions, international systematic norms and laws, as well as economic interdependence, can be interrelated in a way that would encourage peace. And you can break this down. All these different arrows can go different ways, and all these different factors. Economic interdependence can lead to more democracy. As a country becomes better off, citizens are more likely to demand more increased voice in how their country is actually run. But democracy can also lead to economic interdependence because democracies have a more established rule of law and property, and so it's easier to do business. You're more likely to invest in the future, have a more developed economy, which could lead to more economic interactions with other similar states, which could also decrease peace. So you can look at all these different factors and write a great essay on how these relationships could play into it. But basically, Kant's main contribution here is to look at how democracy, economic interdependence, and international law can all feed on each other to help explain why democracies are less likely to go to war. And there's a lot of, this is a very kind of theoretical approach as well, and you can try to operationalize a lot of these things in different ways. One way is to focus on the democratic measures, which I've already talked about, and which we're going to actually apply in our workshops. But for economic interdependence, this is another thing that we can talk about. One measure that you might not have come across, but I think kind of shows the creative ways that people can think about measuring differences across countries, is the Big Mac Index. And Tom Friedman, a New York Times columnist back in '96, kind of came up with this idea that instead of a democratic peace, it's more a cultural kind of interdependence or economic interdependence between different countries. And he argues that two countries with McDonald's have never gone to war with each other. And you see here that is kind of disproven by the current map that I was able to find on Wikipedia. I'm not sure if there's any better data source on this. If so, let me know in the comments below. Between countries that have had McDonald's, this also shows when they actually open them, and war. And you can actually see Ukraine has had a McDonald's since 95 to 99, and Russia has had them since 1990. And in this current conflict that we're living through now, a bunch of international corporations have either indicated that they're going to get rid of their assets and joint ventures in Russia, like British Petroleum, Shell, other oil companies. Apple has shuttered its stores in Russia right now, but one company out of a few that have resisted calls to actually shut down, that has the power to do so, is McDonald's. McDonald's hasn't made any effort to close their stores in Russia, as far as I had heard as of recording this. Starbucks, they have more franchisees, which makes them harder to kind of force them to shut down. But McDonald's, over 80% of the stores in McDonald's, and the McDonald's in Moscow is absolutely amazing, multi-story, really impressive. McDonald's, they haven't taken that step, which is interesting because you'd think it would be relatively easy to shut a restaurant, but they haven't taken that step. And as a side note, is to kind of say that people can come up with proxies for culture, for economic interdependence that you might not have thought of. So this one is looking at the McDonald's theory as a war. You can also come up with the McDonald's theory of currency valuations, which you might have come across or not. The Economist magazine has this lighthearted, they call it lighthearted. I don't think The Economist is very lighthearted. Some of their titles can be fun, some of their articles. But in comparing how much a Big Mac costs in different countries around the world and compared to the US dollar, and you can see that the Swiss franc and the Norwegian krona are overvalued, but in other countries they're substantially undervalued, including Australia estimates, according to the price of a Big Mac, as 22% undervalued. British pound 17%, but it's another way to kind of show, and it'd be interesting to see, given the fall of the ruble, where Russia places on this next year. But it's a way to kind of conceptualize this kind of purchase power parity measure of economic development, how much inflation causes people, or the devaluation of currencies, how much people earn. We've talked about in this class GDP per capita, how much economic production in services and in goods a country produces is a good factor to try to explain whether a country becomes democratic, whether likely to win a war or fight a war. But that ability for people to purchase goods is different in different countries. And so that basket of goods can include a Big Mac or not, but it's a way to kind of compare it. Here's a bit more about how it goes into operationalizing. You can also read more at the link down below. But this is another kind of lighthearted way of kind of showing differences between countries, the democratic explanation of conflict we're going to go into more in the next section. And I guess for me, can you think, besides the Big Mac Index, ways that have value now at differentiating countries and their likelihood to go to war with each other? Because the Big Mac could be an indication of economic costs or cultural relevance. Can you come up with any other kind of measure, whether it's people have talked about Facebook usage, other kind of media consumption, purchasing decisions, whether Amazon ships to a particular country. Netflix got a lot of attention in standardizing its coverage in a bunch of different countries around the world. What other kind of measures could indicate whether countries would have incentives to use violence against each other or against their own state? So this is the second lecture question. Please, those students of mine who care to, I would be interested in reading your comments in Waddle in the appropriate section. And let's just move on a bit to start talking about the inverted U relationship between democracy and conflict. We've mentioned the measures like polity. We've mentioned the definitions of conflict in earlier weeks. One of the takeaways from the Hegre literature review, as well as the Hegre et al.'s empirical models, is that there is something different about different democratic institutions and the likelihood of having domestic as well as international conflict. I just spent the first part of this video talking about international conflict. Now I want to focus on domestic conflict. And you see here that the two extremes, the autocracies on the left and the democracies on the right, are less likely to go to war than those anocracies in the center. This is the substantive effect in the Hegre et al. 2001 article, in which you see the relative risk of civil war as a function of democracy and institutional stability of those democratic institutions. I think, as I've encouraged my students so far this semester, I want to encourage you in the future, the fancy data analysis is interesting and it's important to try to understand the applicability of the findings. But I think what I really care about and what a lot of scholars are caring about is how large that predictive relationship is. And when you see here with this inverted U, in the previous slide, it was just a flat U, but as you see here, you can make it into including time in this relationship as well. As what you see, if regime change happened in a particular year, the relative risk of civil war in those middle democracies are 3 times higher than in high democracies or low democracies. Those anocratic systems are much higher at risk of civil war. And in another graph in this paper, they show South Korea's experience moving from a military dictatorship to democracy, and they climbed this predictive U-shape from low democracy to the middle stages to established democracy in a way that I think is more intuitive than some of the statistical tables that we'll see in this class. And so what you see is, as a country becomes at the extremes of democratic or autocratic, you're more likely to see stability. Russia and Turkmenistan, for all the protest or economic hardship within the countries, are less likely, arguably, to see conflict than those countries that are mixed systems that had some opening, like Myanmar, that had some opening and then backtracked with the military coup. That it's those mixed systems that we're going to be talking about in a bit later on. So what are the relationships? Democracy should theoretically decrease violence for the legitimacy points that I made earlier. Collier, in his 2009 book War, Guns, and Votes, talks about increased levels of accountability and legitimacy in democracies, make it so the grievances aren't there that should lead to violence, as we read in the earlier weeks. In his models, he found an interactive effect of democracy and income. Low-income democracy increases violence. You have the openness without people actually getting the goods. That might increase grievances or increased activities on greed motivations, while high incomes it decreases. And he argues in his book and places a lot of stress on the inflection point at around 2,700 US dollars GDP as of 2009 per capita. That if a country becomes wealthy enough, this interactive effect of democracy and income should dramatically decrease the likelihood that you should see violence. I think that is a very economic take on the matter, and others have not found a similar relationship. And you could think of examples in which you have countries that have GDPs above that still have conflict. But that was empirical models that he had a while ago, and he places the stress on the interaction, as a political economist would, between democracy and economics. And I think, so this is more of a structural argument for what the relationships are between democracy and conflict, right? He talks about accountability and legitimacy, but by and large, the main proxies are political institutions, right? The executive recruitment, executive constraints, how people are selected. But I would argue recent events and some recent literature talks about the importance of leaders in making political decisions that can lead to conflict. These are quite dated now. You can still see Kevin Rudd was in office when all these photos were taken. Find the Kevin Rudd. But I would say there's been another stream of literature that hasn't gotten as much attention in civil wars as opposed to interstate wars. There's a big literature on how political leaders use international conflict and less on domestic stability. And I'm interested to see in the workshops the roles that you think that leaders make in going to conflict. And the Russia-Ukraine conflict is another example of this, right? Whether it is Vladimir Putin making a decision on his own, or whether it's in collaboration with his political elites, or because of domestic economic hardship or other issues, or whether he feels secure domestically, he can act aggressively internationally. But I think in trying to understand democracy and conflict, political leaders don't get as much attention, which I think is an oversight. And that's why I have a PhD student right now, Ernest Akuamoa, who's doing a really interesting dissertation on leaders' effect on the use of election violence, both how long they've been in power, their ability to change those political institutions that I just talked about, like removing term limits, constraints on the executive, as well as whether they were educated in Western universities, how this all kind of plays on how the individual governs the state in the use of repression within a country. Mentioning leaders and repression leads me naturally to Turkmenistan, a country you probably haven't studied that much in any of your other classes. Central Asia is usually overlooked in a lot of international relations classes, maybe a bit in security classes in the response to the Afghan wars in the 80s and since 2001. Turkmenistan is one that has played an important role with since the end of the Cold War in natural gas and natural resources, which we're going to be talking about in a few weeks, and how important natural resources are to leading to conflict between states, as well as providing incentives to use violence within a state. There were international tensions between Turkmenistan sending natural gas to Iran and to Russia. Now they just opened up a pipeline to China. It is often overlooked, but increasingly strategically important. I think they have the 5th largest proven natural gas reserves of any country in the world. And these two leaders, Saparmat Niyazov and Gurbanguly, I'm going to murder his last name, Bergdin. I'm not going to try to say it. It's too late now. But these two leaders have played an important role. They've only had 2 presidents since independence, and I think their roles as leaders in a country that hasn't seen violence but has seen repression would be a non-traditional kind of case study to look at the importance of political institutions in shaping the domestic stability within a country, as well as the opportunities for citizens to act on their own interests and have a voice in the governments of their own country. So let's go ahead and turn now to a couple of brief facts about the Turkmen case before looking at a couple of direct videos. And as I mentioned in the first part of today's lecture, they're having a landmark election this week to nominate to have the 3rd president since independence in 1991. So let's go ahead and move on to Turkmenistan.